The bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled across Rome, their deep notes vibrating through the marble bones of the city. April 26, 2025. A day the world would remember forever. More than 250,000 people filled St. Peter's Square, shoulder to shoulder, their faces lifted toward the soft gray sky. The faithful wept openly. Pilgrims clutched rosaries. World leaders sat beneath solemn banners. Cardinals in crimson robes shimmered in the morning light, each a small figure dwarfed by the immensity of the moment. Today, the world was not divided by borders, race, or faith. Today, they stood as one. Grieving not a king, not an emperor, but a shepherd. Pope Francis. At precisely 10 a.m., the funeral mass began. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, Decano del Collegio Cardinalicio, stepped forward beneath the towering columns of the basilica. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he blessed the simple wooden coffin resting before the altar. A coffin that bore no ornaments. No gold. Only a cross and a small bouquet of white lilies, the Pope's request. The Latin prayers rose into the air like incense. Choirs sang ancient hymns. Dignitaries lowered their heads. And for a while it seemed that everything would proceed as planned, beautiful, historic, reverent. But in the crowd, unnoticed at first, a man stood near the outer edge. Not dressed like the others. No suit. No clerical collar. Just a plain dark coat and a small worn satchel slung across his chest. He stood very still. Watching. Waiting. Few noticed when he stepped forward, past the throngs of mourners, moving closer to the inner gate where only clergy and dignitaries were allowed. A guard moved to stop him, but hesitated. Something in the man's face, not defiance, but sorrow so profound it paralyzed those who saw it. The man moved with purpose. Not rushing. Not pushing. Just walking, steady, sure, like someone who belonged. At first, the guard stiffened. A few shifted in position, fingers near radios. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was he? Why was he moving forward? In such a sacred event, there was no room for disruption. No space for unsanctioned acts. Yet the man's face, lined, weathered, tear-streaked, held no trace of rebellion. Only a depth of grief so raw that it cut through the polished choreography of the funeral. He reached the first barrier, the line separating pilgrims from the clergy. He placed his hand on the low rail. And for a long moment, he simply stood there, his head bowed, as if asking permission from a presence no one else could see. Then he crossed. 1 step. 2 steps. Onto the smooth marble. A gasp rose from the crowd. Some cardinals turned their heads. A few guards began to move, instinct and protocol driving them. But then something happened. Cardinal Montini, standing closest to the aisle, raised his hand, subtle but firm. Let him pass. The guards froze, lowered their arms, stepped back. Not out of fear. Not out of confusion. Out of something older than protocol, reverence. The man continued forward, the cathedral's massive dome looming above him, the coffin resting not 50 feet away. His footsteps echoed against the ancient stones, each step louder than the choral hymns that filled the air. And then he stopped. Just a few meters from the coffin. From the man the world had come to mourn. The mysterious figure raised his eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it pierced through the prayers and the ceremony like a bell in a storm. The square held its breath. Over 250,000 people, presidents, peasants, cardinals, and pilgrims all stopped. Even the wind seemed to still. The man stood before the simple wooden coffin of Pope Francis, his hands trembling at his sides. His dark coat fluttered around his ankles. And then, in a voice rough with grief, he spoke, "You knew me, when no one else would even look at me." The words rang out in the silence. Soft. Broken. True. A priest near the altar dropped his prayer book. A child clutched his mother's hand tighter. An elderly bishop lowered his head and wept without shame. No one moved to stop the man now. Not even the guards. Not even the cardinals. Not even the strict traditions that had stood untouched for centuries. Because somehow they all knew this was no interruption. This was the funeral's true beginning. The man continued, stepping closer. He placed a small, crumpled item on the ground beside the Pope's coffin, a photograph. Weathered. Folded 100 times. Sacred in its simplicity. It showed a much younger Jorge Mario Bergoglio, long before he wore white robes, sitting on a street curb, sharing a sandwich with a homeless man. The mysterious man. The crowd stirred. A wave of realization swept through them. This wasn't just a mourner. This wasn't a mistake. This was someone who knew the Pope not as a symbol, but as a savior. The man wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. And then he spoke once more. He didn't just preach mercy, he lived it. Even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. And with those words, the massive ancient walls of tradition that surrounded them all cracked open, not with scandal, but with grace. The man's voice shook as he continued, but the words came like a river breaking through a dam, unstoppable, pure. He knelt now beside the coffin, not in defiance but in awe. And he began to speak of a life few had ever glimpsed. "I was a nobody," he said, "when he found me. Living on the streets of Buenos Aires. No shoes. No family. No name that mattered. One cold night I was sleeping near the cathedral steps. Most people passed me like I was a stain. But not him. He sat beside me. Didn't ask questions. Didn't preach. He shared his bread and his silence. And when he left, he gave me something. Not money. Not pity. But his coat." Gasps rippled across the crowd. He said, "When you wear this, you're no longer invisible." I wore that coat until it fell apart. But I never forgot the man who made me feel human again. In the front rows, seasoned cardinals wept openly. World leaders bowed their heads. Pilgrims clutched their hearts. Because this wasn't a story of theology or power or ceremony. It was a story of love so ordinary, it became extraordinary. The man stood up slowly, his knees cracking from years of wear. He looked out across the sea of faces, through the marble arches of the basilica, past the cameras and the golden crosses. And he said, "You came to bury a pope. But know this, you are saying goodbye to the man who fed the forgotten. Who clothed the invisible. Who loved the least of these when no one else dared." And as he spoke, the great bells of St. Peter's, without being ordered, began to ring. Not in mourning, but in thanksgiving. For a long, sacred moment after the mysterious man's words, no one moved. The entire square, the basilica, the watching world, sat frozen under the weight of something far greater than grief. They were standing in the presence of love itself. The cardinals at the altar bowed their heads. Presidents wiped their faces with shaking hands. Pilgrims sank to their knees on the cold stones of the square. Mothers pulled their children closer. Old men sobbed openly against the shoulders of strangers they had never met. It didn't matter where they came from. It didn't matter what they believed. In that instant, they were just souls gathered in gratitude. Grateful not for power, not for politics, not for a perfect man, but for a man who chose mercy when no one was watching. Up at the altar, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re slowly closed his prayer book. He had prepared a beautiful eulogy, crafted with ancient prayers, timeless scripture, the wisdom of centuries. But now he knew. It was no longer needed. The homily had already been given, not from the pulpit, but from the broken voice of a once-forgotten man. In the crowd, a child reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of bread. Without a word, he broke it in half and handed it to the stranger kneeling beside him. A simple act. A quiet revolution. The final sermon of Francis had already begun to echo. The man lowered his head once more, stood quietly before the coffin, and pressed 2 fingers to his lips, a kiss. A blessing. A goodbye. No guards moved. No cardinals interrupted. The world watched, breathless, as he turned without fanfare and began walking back through the sea of mourners. Some tried to follow him. Some reached out to call him. But within seconds he had merged into the endless throng, the nameless faces, the anonymous souls, the ocean of grief and gratitude. He did not give interviews. He did not take selfies. He did not leave a name. He left a story. One stronger than marble. One more eternal than gold. Later, when Vatican security combed through footage, they found no official records of his entry. No guest list. No identification. It was as if he had appeared from thin air, a final miracle for a pope who spent his life performing invisible ones. An old nun, passing by the altar, whispered under her breath, "Perhaps he was one of the least of these Francis spoke about, come back to thank him." And no one corrected her. Because somehow everyone knew she was right. As the sun dipped behind the columns of St. Peter's Square, the funeral mass slowly drew to its formal end. The Latin hymns floated into the air. The incense curled toward the heavens. The ancient rituals unfolded as they had for centuries. But beneath the grand beauty of it all, something else had taken root, a quiet, unstoppable movement. It began with a woman in the third row. A street vendor from Naples who had traveled 2 days by train to be here. She stood, and from her pocket, she took out a tiny loaf of bread, a simple peasant's roll. She broke it in half. And gently, silently, she offered one half to the stranger beside her. At first, it seemed isolated. But then a man from Argentina, hands trembling, did the same. And then a refugee from Sudan. And a farmer from France. And a bishop from Poland. Soon, across the entire sea of mourners, bread was being broken and shared among strangers. No words. No orders. Just love multiplying itself again and again until the square itself seemed to breathe with life. High above, from the windows of the Apostolic Palace, some cardinals watched in stunned silence. One old Monsignor, tears shining in his eyes, whispered, "It's the gospel, but they are writing it with their hands." The simple wooden coffin of Pope Francis was lifted then, carried gently toward the basilica for his final rest. Not amid shouts, not amid trumpets, but under a silent rain of shared bread, of quiet weeping, of grateful souls bound together by an invisible thread. He came to feed the hearts of the world. And the world finally had learned how to feed each other. Long after the crowds had thinned, after the banners were folded away, after the news cameras packed up and left, St. Peter's Square remained. Empty, vast, holy. But it was not truly empty. Because across the world, in cities and villages, in deserts and mountains, the final echo of Pope Francis's life was just beginning. It wasn't written in stone. It wasn't carved into monuments. It wasn't captured by speeches. It lived in the hands that broke bread for strangers. In the eyes that dared to look at the forgotten. In the hearts that chose to stay when the world looked away. It lived in mercy, not as an idea, but as a living, breathing revolution of love. Some would forget his name. Many would misquote his words. History would tuck him into chapters and textbooks. But those who had been touched by the mystery of this day, who had seen a broken man speak truth over a pope's coffin, would never forget what truly mattered, that the smallest kindness can change a life, that a simple act of mercy can echo louder than any empire, and that true greatness doesn't need to be seen to change the world forever. He fed the forgotten. He clothed the invisible. He loved the world without asking if it deserved it. And today, if you listen carefully to the silence, you will hear him still. Because God's legacy is in all of us, and it is our duty to spread it throughout the world.